Hello and welcome to part 2 of my Saw VII Rewrite. If you're here now, hopefully that means that you have already read part 1. But if not, no worries. I will include a link to the part 1 document and the part 2 document in the description to this video. But first things first, thank you to Luke Headland, who is responsible for the artwork you see in the thumbnail for this video. If you guys still have not checked out his social media sites, those are once again linked in the description to this video, and I encourage you to do so. The rest of this video will be me discussing part 2 and some of the scenes within it. So please do not continue on with this video if you have not already read both part 1 and part 2. But once you have done that, if you feel like it, please do come back to this video and check it out. As I said in the video to part 1, please do not comment any spoilers in this video beyond part 2 if you're watching this after the other parts have come out. But let's go ahead and dive in. So in part 1, I talked about the traps and me writing them and how it was very difficult for me to come up with traps that hadn't already been done or weren't very similar to traps that had already been done. And this folding trap I was very proud of. I thought it was completely original until about a few weeks ago.
Rack was another one that really got me. Originally I'd conceived it as something that kind of folds a person up into a box. James and I have always been really keen on a trap that kind of folds a human body up. But production design issues and logistical issues always kind of inform what you can do. So it kind of morphed into the trap you see in the finished film.
When I was watching that earlier this month, like my jaw literally dropped while I was eating. I was like, that's exactly what I wrote. And again, I thought it was an original idea, but now I have to wonder, like, I mean, it just seems like such a huge coincidence. Like, was that rattling around in my brain like subconsciously? I had only ever seen that once before, and that was when I was 16 years old. So yeah, the fact that that seems to have been buried in my brain somewhere for half of my life at this point. It's kind of scary. At any rate, I'm glad I ended up watching that again earlier this month, because if I hadn't, then I would have been presenting that trap as something I was proud of being really original. And yeah, I'm sure people would have called me out on that. So I think most people that are watching this and reading my script are probably big enough Saw fans that they already know this. But for anyone that may not, Saw 6, the director's cut, has a post-credit scene which shows that Amanda, shortly before killing Lynn and then dying herself, went to Corbett, Jeff and Lynn's daughter, and whispered through the keyhole, "Don't trust the one that saves you." And the purpose of this scene, and the reason that it really should have been included in the theatrical version of the film as well, I feel, is that it retroactively explains why Perez and Erickson are already suspicious of Hoffman for the entirety of Saw 6. It's clear that something happened between Saw 5 and Saw 6, because at the end of Saw 5, Erickson goes from, looking at all this overwhelming evidence against Strom being a Jigsaw accomplice, and then when you next see him in Saw 6, him and Perez, it's very clear that they're doing things to try and rattle Hoffman and get him to slip up and or confess. And so the question is, what happened between Saw 5 and Saw 6 to make them start to suspect Hoffman instead of Strom? And again, I think the Saw 6 director's cut does an excellent job of answering that question. Basically, it was Amanda's revenge from the grave. She said what she said to Corbett, who would then presumably go on to tell police. And while that would be somewhat incriminating toward Hoffman, it is far from hard evidence that he's guilty of anything. And frankly, she doesn't even say that the person that's going to save Corbett is an accomplice. All she says is not to trust them. So basically what this amounts to is causing Erickson and Perez to suspect Hoffman, but having no usable evidence against him, which is why they end up spending the entirety of Saw 6 putting Hoffman in these situations to make him uncomfortable, to put this pressure on him, and again, to get him to slip up and hopefully confess. So in Saw 3, we see John building the Billy puppet for Amanda's tape. And at that point in the series, it would seem that that was the very first Billy puppet that he ever built, because chronologically, Amanda's game was the first one where we see Billy the puppet. Saw 5 and its opening game with Seth is kind of the thing that retconned that. If Hoffman was using Billy the puppet in a tape in the Seth Baxter game, that must mean that Billy the puppet existed at the crime scene where they found Cecil, and that a tape was made for Cecil with Billy the puppet. I really liked the idea that John's original intention for Billy the puppet was to be specifically, was that he would build one for Cecil and he was going to build one for Amanda, because Billy the puppet is meant to represent the child that they took from him. Of course, once Hoffman uses Billy, not understanding the significance of him, that's kind of the start of where Billy becomes a part of other games, besides just Cecil and Amanda as John originally intended. So I don't think the idea that Tapp was lured to the Stygian warehouse in Saw 1, I don't think that idea is too controversial. I know it's certainly not, I'm not the only one that has believed that. The fact that Amanda's tape was filmed with a fire alarm going off in the background, the fact that John just happens to show up right after they've arrived and discovered Jeff in the drill chair, and that when he does arrive, he's wearing a hood and hiding his face. And at that exact moment is when he was going to be testing this drill chair on Jeff. And I think in the context of the larger series, once we learn more about the Jigsaw character, it definitely would go against who he is and what he professes to believe for him to just murder this guy just to test out the chair. Also, why would he need to test the chair? I think it's pretty obvious that that would kill anyone that's sitting in it. So yeah, taking all of that into account, I do believe pretty firmly that John was trying to test Tapp. So I think a long-standing mystery from the original Saw film is what the deal was with the man that was part of Amanda's game. Why was he in the condition he was in? And again, as the Saw series progresses and John seems to be more and more established as somebody who firmly believes that everyone deserves a chance at survival, it just raises all these questions of how exactly did the setup for Amanda's game become what it was, and why was this guy a part of it? And for me, the answer to that question came from the answer to a much more important question, which was, where was the turn for Hoffman? Like, where did he go from being a somewhat remorseful accomplice to John to someone who was satisfying this bloodlust that he develops through these jigsaw games? And yeah, I think that this is the point in time where the fundamental philosophical conflict between John and Hoffman is solidified. They have very opposing ideas of what Jigsaw is and what he should be. And as I talked about in the introduction video for this script, I do think that they both represent conflicting ideas of justice. John believes in rehabilitation, whereas Hoffman believes that justice should be a form of retribution or punishment. But the thing I really like about that scene and how it turned out is that Hoffman is kind of right about a couple of things, specifically about John and him being motivated by anger to some degree. John is angry at the world. You know, after the loss of his son, I mean, we see in Saw 4 the way that he pushes Jill away and he pushes Art away. He's very angry at that time in his life. And being diagnosed with cancer shortly after that obviously doesn't help. And I think if you look at John's earlier games, you know, Paul's in the razor wire and Mark's in the room filled with glass and he's got the flammable gel on him. Based on those tapes and those individuals being targeted specifically, I think it's safe to say that the earlier Jigsaw was more angry. I think on a surface level, he believed what he was telling himself, that he wanted to help these people. But I think he was ignoring that other part of him that was angry. And I think that is what Hoffman confronts John with. And John has to face what he's saying. And I think the reason that John has such an emotional reaction to it is because there is truth in what Hoffman is saying about him. And so John kind of realizes that he needs to prove to himself whether or not he actually wants someone like Amanda, who did this awful thing to him. He needs to prove to himself whether or not he actually wants her to survive. And so when she does escape and he feels only relief and happiness, I think that is a turning point for John. It confirms that his motives, at least, are sincere. And I think that's the turning point at which he lets go of the anger and it does become much more about helping people. And again, going back to the religious allegory, as I see it, I think early Jigsaw is much more of the Old Testament version of God, who has this righteous anger and wrath. Whereas after Amanda's game, he's much more of the New Testament representation of God, who is much more forgiving. Pamela was always interesting to me because she's in Saw 5, but very briefly. She's in the press conference or the ceremony where Hoffman's promoted and given the award. In the theatrical version, she has a line of dialogue, and in the director's cut, she doesn't, but she's still very much present. And then she obviously plays a bigger role in Saw 6. The fact that the filmmakers went out of their way to introduce Pamela in Saw 5, kind of knowing that they were going to have her do something more in Saw 6, to me, I always felt that meant that she was going to play a fairly significant role, and I would argue that wasn't really fulfilled in Saw 6. I do think that it was pretty significant that she delivers the copy of the letter to Jill, but outside of that, her only purpose in Saw 6 is to witness her brother's death. And so another thing I would have liked to see in the finale to the series was for her to play an active role. in how this story is resolved. That's everything I have right now for part 2. I hope you guys will come back for part 3.
Hello there. If you'd like to be notified when more videos like this one arrive, just click the circle to subscribe. In the meantime, you can click either of the 2 boxes to check out other content from this channel. Or don't. The choice is yours.